Today's reading is taken from Isaiah chapter 6, starting at the first verse. Isaiah's commission. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Holy, 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 Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried, I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, See, this has touched your lips, and your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And I said, Here am I, send me. This reading is from the beginning of the 6th chapter of Isaiah, as I said. But if we look back at chapter 5, you would see that the world to Isaiah seemed a very messy, evil place, and a far call from what God had intended. A world dominated by the rich, the strong, the powerful, and a world where God does not seem to get a look in anywhere. A world which is pretty frightening and depressing to many. A world which we probably would find reasonably easy to identify with today, where sometimes it does look as if God doesn't really get a look in. A world which is pretty frightening and depressing to many who live in many places around this world. There are wars between nations, there are civil wars, there are coups of various types, and always violent crime and hate. But if all that Isaiah had preached was judgment and destruction, it would have been a very depressing book and a world without hope. But he doesn't do that, because Isaiah has had a vision of God and an encounter with him, which was to remain so vivid in his mind for the rest of his life. In these first 8 verses of chapter 6, Isaiah sees God on the throne in the temple, and it's an awesome and impressive vision. God is high in the temple, lifted up, exalted. The train of his robe fills the whole of the temple. God is so big he can't even fit in this enormous building. Imagine an enormous building today, such as perhaps the biggest football stadium you can imagine, or St. Paul's Cathedral, and imagine God in and still not being able to fit in these places. God is so big, we cannot imagine him filling any of these places, and yet he fills the world very easily. And this image brings it home to Isaiah. The whole temple shakes with the angels' voices. Then one of the seraphim takes a burning coal and touches Isaiah's tongue. Imagine how that would be feeling. And it's to take away his sin once and for all, and to anoint him to his calling. The Lord asks, Whom shall I send? Who will go for us? To which Isaiah replies, Here am I, send me. It's a life-changing experience, and the hymn based on this reading is often sung at ordination services, and whenever we sing it, it reminds myself and many others of our calling to follow God and to go out into the world at his bidding, but it is calling everyone who follows and believes in God and Christ. God asks us all, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? To which we are to reply, here am I, send me. Isaiah realised that although God will judge the people and the nations for their sins, he so wants us all to turn back to him so we can be forgiven and comforted. The destruction, fear and death will give way to recreation and life when we are touched by God and allow God into our lives. The touch of God leads the way of his commandments, the way of his promises, fulfilled in Jesus. God brings his people home by sending Jesus. Even the dark, the depressing and the frightening becomes transformed by God when we allow him to touch us. In our society and in our lives, God continues to bring his people home. And there will be places and times of real joy on our way, as there will be times and places of sadness and fear, which is why it's not always easy. Sometimes it's very difficult to see the road that we are on. Think of the images in the Pilgrim's Progress, the hard and difficult ways, the narrow ways, the many doubts and fears. For Isaiah, it must have been difficult to see and hear God's messages at times. It was so cluttered with the ways of humanity, the weary battles they fought, the deaths, the fears. God, it seemed, was absent. He, like he sometimes feels today for a lot of people, but God was still there and is still here today. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today and forever. We may not always have a clear vision of Christ to help us on our way, as the image Isaiah is seeing in this reading, but he is there always. And sometimes when we're on the path, we forget to look up. We get so bogged down with the everyday stuff, we forget to look up, to take in the glory of Christ, to understand the reason for taking the walk in the first place, to look around us at the creation God gave us, and to walk in his footsteps. When I first went to the Grand Canyon a few years ago, I had to keep looking down to make sure my feet were taking me the right way. But I had to stop incredibly often, every few moments, to really take in what I was seeing, to look at the majesty, the complete awe of it all. And we all need to look up from our ordinariness, the everyday, to see God in action, God in ultimate control, where joy begins to break out, where the sick are comforted, where the fearful are strengthened, and we can be encouraged to say, here am I, send me. We need to trust and walk in God's path, to take in what God has given us, this amazing world and creation, ourselves, our families, our friends, all in this world is God's creation. And he has given us the most precious gift of all, his Son, Jesus Christ. But we also have to fulfill our faith and belief by walking in God's footsteps, bringing his light and his hope to the world.